So structs are pretty useful for combining data and for grouping related data together. But that's not all you can do with structs. Instead, you can also attach functions to structs. And a function that was attached to a struct then is called a method. For example, here, in this very simple demo app, we could attach this output user details function to a struct, to the user struct to be precise, since it really only works with that type of data anyways. And since it is a function that only exists to output data for such a user struct. So attaching it to that struct makes sense. For that, we can grab it, though that's technically not required. You could also leave it here, but I'll move it up here right below the struct just so that we have both in the same picture, so to say. But you can store this function anywhere. You do not attach it to a struct by moving it below that struct. Instead, you do attach it to that struct. You do turn it into a method of that struct, as it's called, by adding a pair of parentheses in front of the name of the function. So after the func keyword, but in front of the function name. And here you now specify the type of data, the struct typically, to which that function should be attached. In this case, user, because that is the struct to which I do want to attach it. Now you can also specify a name here, for example, you again. You could also use user, but since user looks a bit weird, I'll use you. And now with that done, you can access the struct to which this function has been attached through that you name here. Which of course means that we can get rid of this parameter here. We don't need it anymore because this function now belongs to that struct and has access to that struct through that user here. And therefore this function here also continues to work because when we access you here, so if we access the user here inside of the function body, we're accessing it through this special reference here, you could say, which gives us access to that user struct because this function has been turned into a method of the user struct by adding this extra code here. And this extra piece of code here is called a receiver argument. So it's a special kind of argument, a special kind of parameter, you could say, which is not specified here in the regular parameter list, but which instead is specified here in front of the function name to, as mentioned, turn this function into a method of that received type here. And with that, we can go down to our code where we call output user details, and we now have to call this function in a different way. Instead of calling it like this as a standalone function, which it isn't anymore, you can't call it like this anymore if you attach it to a struct like this. So instead of doing that, you now use your struct, in my case here app user, and then you again use the dot notation, and here you now don't just find these fields that you added, but also any methods that have been added to this struct. In this case, this one output user details method. And we can now call it like this, and we don't have to pass any argument to this method, to this function anymore, because it doesn't want any. It wants no arguments. And this user struct value here, it will be passed to this function here automatically by Go because we turned this function into a method of this struct and we're calling it on this struct. And therefore, if we save this and we run this code, I can again enter all my details here like this. And as a result, I get the same output as before, but now with help of that method.